another harbinger of spring kind of flower in Ohio that is in bloom now is a wetland plant. Can anybody tell me what it is?
Is it skunk cabbage?
It is skunk cabbage.
Oh, you
That's
win
a
again,
great-
Hannah.
That's great. I feel like I should have picked that instead because I feel like that's a little bit more plentiful around right now.
Well, the harbinger of spring is a little more challenging to find, but it's worth it. So anyhow, the importance of wetlands, I'll get through this, and then if there's questions, I'll see where the discussion goes from there. So this was a presentation that I originally put together for Ohio Wetlands Association, where for about 10 years, I was the founder and president of that nonprofit. I've been involved with wetlands for about 30 years, 20 years before founding Ohio Wetlands Association. That is still going on, and we've got a wonderful conference coming up the beginning of next month called Vernalpalooza, a very special kind of wetland habitat in Ohio, seasonal wetland, mostly in wooded locations. That's coming up. Ask me more and I'll tell you more. We're looking at this today, partly because it is the month where World Wetland Day occurs, but it's also a chance for us to think about the value of rain gardens, which are gardens that hold water an extended period of time rather than just shunting them off into the storm sewers. And they're a great place to put a nice set of wet-loving plants, add some diversity into your environment by having wetland plants. And so when I go through these points about the importance of wetlands, see if you can think about how it may be the importance of having a rain garden and how that might affect your immediate environment. So those of us who have been paying attention to environmental issues can get extremely depressed when it all comes weighing down on us. And so here's, just a word storm of environmental issues that come up. We know that, our planet is becoming less hospitable, even as the population continues to grow. The resources are stretched. There's more and more people every day that are doing less and less well. We know that biodiversity is collapsing, and some people are beginning to call this, some environmental people are beginning to call this the sixth great extinction. The fifth one you might remember was when the dinosaurs were all killed off about 66 million years ago. So yeah, things are looking pretty rough for us here on planet Earth. And part of that is exacerbated by climate change. Part of it is population. So some of the things that we're experiencing now, climate change is already with us. We haven't had it as bad here in Ohio as some parts of the country, but we are likely in this part of the world to see hotter summers, longer dry periods, milder and wetter winters. And we're going to see interrupted rain patterns where it rains less often, but when it does rain, it rains a lot. So heavy downpours, that is happening much more often than it did a century ago. So weird dynamics in weather. Some people are calling it weather weirding rather than climate change, but either way, things are different. So here's a drought scenario with climate change. The different colored bars in this chart here show possible scenarios in 30-year gaps here. We've got currently the likelihood of water shortages or drought in the Midwest is slightly more than it was 50 years ago. In the next 30 years, depending on what we do, it could be much, much worse or just a little bit worse. So if we don't do anything, that's the red bar future. If we do everything we can, we've got the orange bar future to look at. So these were some of the projections, I think 10 years ago when I put these slides together. So we're seeing flooding. So here's places that it has never flooded before, and it gets flooded really bad. Anybody remember what this city is? This was,
I think it's Houston.
or Nashville. I think something like that. Anyhow, this is the US of A. They never had a flood like this before. Part of it is our land management, and part of it is just weather patterns that is doing this. This kind of thing that was called a 500-year flood. Very likely that everybody within their lifetime will witness a 500-year flood, as strange as that is. So here in this part of Ohio, we're seeing harmful algae blooms on Lake Erie. If that image doesn't make sense to you, it's Detroit in the upper left and Cleveland in the lower right, and that's Lake Erie in the middle. During an algae bloom, a satellite view. So we get heavy rains. They, especially if that happens in the spring, when crops are first planted and fertilized, you get nutrient runoff that feeds algae growth. We get warmer weather during the summer that really incubates those algae and makes it even worse. And these blue-green algae that are the most problematic can produce toxics. And there's millions of people that depend on Lake Erie for their drinking water, which means now we have to spend millions and millions of dollars upgrading drinking water systems in order to deal with that sort of thing. So is everybody depressed now? Yeah. And of course, these flash flooding, thunderstorm kinds of events are going to cause erosion, wash things away. Just we're in trouble, basically. Losing groundwater, because if it rains suddenly, it all runs off. It doesn't soak in. And so even wells that are drilled deeper and deeper still create this cone of depression, and that groundwater doesn't get recharged. So we're depleting aquifers. Some of that water that was contributed to where these deep wells are going is from the last ice age. It's not going to be replenished anytime soon. And of course, extinctions here in Ohio. Here's just a short list of some of the birds that Ohio considers endangered. All right. So anybody that was holding back and not feeling depressed about that, I hope I got you with those last couple of slides. So is there hope? Is the next part. And my answer is yes, indeed. And it's people like us, it's organizations like Wild Ones that are providing us with hope. But I will add, it's wetlands that provide us with hope. The wise use of wetlands, as described by the Ramsar Agreement, I think that was about 1972, that established World Wetland Day on February 2nd, promoting and educating on the wise use of wetlands globally. And most every country signed on to that said, that's a good idea. Not everybody could agree on the wise use of wetlands. And of course, there are pressures that are working against the wise use of wetlands, because we're people and we do things that are not always in our long-term best interest. But what I want to do is go through some of these environmental issues that I've just laid out and describe how wetlands are a major part or should be considered as a functional part of the solutions to many of these problems. So one of the things that wetlands do and do really well is capture carbon. So here in this image, this is a peat mine. It's a wetland that has been drained, and they're carving out this really deep layer of peat, and then laying it out. So in the upper left, they carve out slabs of this waterlogged peat, and they lay it out on the ground to dry, and then they can make potting soil out of it. Or more traditionally, it was used as fuel, because this stuff will burn. Once it's dry, it'll burn. But wetlands are really good at absorbing carbon dioxide from the air. So as a part of this carbon cycle between earth and water and air, wetlands are an essential part and do more to take carbon out of the air and store it permanently, I would say, second only to the oceans themselves. And the oceans may be reaching their capacity to absorb carbon. So the photosynthesis, the plant material that grows in these wetlands, capture the carbon dioxide, they die, and in these waterlogged environments, the plant material does not fully decompose, and so is stored. And in wetlands, like the one that used to be here where this image is, that carbon can be stored for millions of years. The fossil fuels that we are consuming now, the oil and coal, is produced as a result of wetlands that captured carbon from the atmosphere and deposited. So as we mine fossil fuels today, we are mining carbon that was sequestered hundreds of millions of years ago. So the potential to permanently lock up carbon from the atmosphere in wetlands is still with us today. We just need to take advantage of that. That is what I would call wise use of wetlands. Stop exposing this carbon to the atmosphere where it leads to a greenhouse gas, and preserve and restore wetlands that will help reverse that trend. So wetlands are one of the most productive systems in the world, meaning that in a wetland environment, more carbon is, through photosynthesis, converted into carbohydrates, into plant material, into living material than in any other environment, except, close contenders to wetlands are tropical rainforests and coral reefs, as far as being the most productive environments, creating the most living material on Earth. Some people say, well, what about swamp gas? What about the methane? Yes, there is, but in a global picture, methane, the CH4, is minuscule, a very minor contributor to greenhouse gas compared to all of the other things that are contributing to global warming. So to reverse climate change, we need the wise use of wetlands as a sink, not a source, but as a sink for carbon. And they are extremely good at that. So drought is another issue, and wetlands can help with that. Wetlands store water above and below ground. So as wetlands capture water from rain and from runoff, some of it infiltrates and feeds groundwater below the surface, and that has a number of benefits. But rather than letting water just run off straight from the land to the ocean, wetlands can hold that where it can be more useful for us, and for the environment. Having water that is able to get into the ground, that's infiltration, that is a benefit for many reasons. So this, one of the great things about wildlife is that they often do a great deal of work for us for free. That's an environmental service, and beavers are one of those things. Of course, beavers are considered a pest by many, and in many parts of the country for many years, there was a bounty on them. So, boy, if you could kill a beaver and turn it into your wildlife manager, you could get some money, not just for the pelt, but just because you killed it. Whereas today, people are seeing the environmental benefits of beavers and are actually taking them into some places in the Western United States. There are projects in this this kind of a beaver method of improving the environment. They are actually taking like a mule train up into the mountains in a dry river channel. They're carting these beavers up and taking some bales of straw and some stakes and blocking the water that's coming down a little stream. So they'll put the bales out on the ground. They'll stake them in place to back up a little bit of water, release the beavers. The beavers work with those bales that have already started it and build a dam and slow down that water runoff. They can build a very big pond where there was nothing at all. And by using this natural process, many tributaries have been restored so that they have a more continuous flow. They don't flash flood. And incredible things have happened, like, oh, fish populations have come back. And now there's recreational fishing downstream because of the benefit of slowing that water down and having that trickle effect, having continuous flow so that the fish can survive, building that riparian environment, managing the drought, reversing some of the effects of drought. So that's the Leave It to Beaver approach, if I can refer to another really old TV show. And of course, wetlands are very good at flood control. Here in this image, you can see the top image and the bottom image are different because the top image has some ponds and intact wetlands. And so you've got a place for water to be stopped, slowed down, held in place when there is a rain event. It doesn't all just rush to the river right away. Whereas in the lower image, you can see that the wetlands have been filled or drained. And now when it rains, the water goes directly into the river very quickly. And downstream then, the river system itself can't handle all that sudden influx of water. And so there are floods where traditionally there wouldn't have been floods. So we've seen this happen in many places where wetlands have been removed, and then there's flooding as a result, and not just because of climate change and these sudden downpours, but in some of the Mississippi flooding, there's people that have crunched numbers and said, well, if we could restore about 4 million acres, about half of the former wetlands, that would be a huge amount of water that could be held back in the upper Mississippi River basin. And if that could be done, it would be more than enough to present a flood event like the one in 93, and I think that was one that really messed up New Orleans and other areas along the lower Mississippi. But the work had to be done in the upper Mississippi. And then if you do a cost comparison, well, what's it going to cost to take an acre of farmland out of production and restore some wetland? And it would be cost effective, even if we're talking about $500 million. So here it shows how we've managed the Mississippi traditionally is to build this big dike to keep the river on one side and the natural floodplain isolated from it for other uses, to build on or to farm. So the damage in this 1993 flood was about $20 billion because the dikes were not able to contain the river. Whereas if you paid $5,000 an acre to restore wetlands, let the wetlands do their job, it would add up to about $20 billion. So in just mitigating one flood event, it'd pay for itself. And here's an example of floodplain. When you look at this is erosion control. So when flooding waters, instead of roaring down the main channel of a diked river system, it's allowed to spread out. These are calm waters. It holds the water, it slows the water down. It's going to take weeks for this water to get back into the main channel, and it's slow. So erosion is less, the energy is less, the sediment can drop out and fertilize these floodplains, enriching them just the way the Nile did for thousands of years back in ancient Egypt. So these flooded areas can be very rich, very productive areas. And if you've ever walked along one of our local rivers after a flood in the floodplains, I've seen this along the Huron River a day after a flood. You walk out in the mucky, muddy, silted up ground, and then there's all these little fish that get stranded. You've just created a very rich environment. A friend of mine has a hayfield in just this kind of location. Some of the best hay in the county because it catches these floodwaters, and it doesn't hurt the hay at all.
Does the hay also catch the fish?
Yes. So that's part of the nutrient load that this hayfield receives.
It's goodies for the birds too, probably.
But that's true. That's true. So yeah, connecting floodplains, letting the floodplains do their work is a kind of free wetland service that can be provided if we just let it. And of course, recharging groundwater. I don't want to go into a lot of detail on this diagram, but aquifers are where water is stored long term, and it slows the flow to the ocean. But you see here the river in between. Rivers are usually connected to the groundwater aquifer. And so during a drought, a river can still be receiving regular supplies of water and continuing to flow because it is slowly percolating in from the aquifer itself. But if there's no wetlands to capture that rainwater and let it soak in, then that aquifer can become diminished, and then that affects the river itself. So rivers here in Lorain County, the Black River does this quite a bit, is that the flow stops in summer. It becomes a series of stagnant pools, sometimes for many weeks or months, depending on rainfall. It's mostly direct rainfall driven rather than aquifer driven kind of a river, the way the environment is right now. And of course, biodiversity. Wetlands have the greatest biodiversity. Those of us who are birders love going to wetlands because we see really great birds there. And that's just the things that are most obvious are the birds, but the rest of biodiversity in smaller animals, in amphibians and reptiles, in macroinvertebrates, it is just incredibly rich in wetlands. That's where the biodiversity is. Whether you're talking about a seasonal wetland like vernal pools in some of our woods or in some of the great coastal marshes that we have, especially in along the western basin of Lake Erie, those are the rich areas. So it compares in diversity to rainforests and coral reefs in species richness. Very productive areas. And of course, wetlands assist in cleaning up the water and reducing the risk of harmful algal blooms. The fact that Ohio has this program called H2 Ohio and is contributing millions of dollars to wetland restoration across the state is having a tremendous impact on water quality because they're funding a lot of wetland restoration projects where water is now intercepted by wetlands before it gets into the major trunks of rivers flowing into Lake Erie or directly into Lake Erie itself. And they're also working on the Ohio River watershed as well. I shouldn't just narrow that just down to Lake Erie. It is throughout the state in both of our watersheds, Great Lakes watershed and the Ohio River watershed as well. And wetlands do a fantastic job of absorbing nutrients. That's the main thing we think of with algae blooms. Phosphorus is the biggest issue in the Lake Erie watershed. Nitrogen is the biggest issue in algae blooms in the Ohio River watershed. But it's nutrients in general. Whatever you throw at it, wetlands are able to mitigate the effects of these nutrients. But that doesn't end there. It's not just the nutrients that are absorbed in these wetlands. It's chemical pollution as well. A lot of pesticide runoff that gets into a wetland, those chemicals can actually be denatured. E. coli gets into a wetland, it gets absorbed. It doesn't get passed on. Great way to reduce beach closures on Lake Erie is to have wetlands that remove the E. coli from the water before it gets to Lake Erie, and then they have to close the beaches. So the benefits of having wetlands intercepting the water before it gets to public use areas means that you can have waters. You know, our ultimate goal is to have waters that are drinkable and fishable and swimmable. We want all those things. And I think as human beings and citizens, we have a right to water that is drinkable, fishable, and swimmable. And many other wetland services besides. I won't belabor the point, but the list goes on and on. A great recreation, fish nurseries, where wetlands on Lake Erie are actually articulating with the lake. You have huge fish nurseries. If the fish can get in there and breed, that's where they love to spawn. Slowing down water surges, shoreline stabilization, wetlands do all of this. In some communities, Native Americans used to get wild rice from these coastal wetlands. In some places in Wisconsin, they still are. And places for fur and fiber, other resources that humans that live close to the land are able to make use of. Just to get slightly off track, there are some people that speculate that where the Tigris and Euphrates River go through Iraq and end up in the Persian Gulf, there's a large marshy area that some people think was the origin of the story of the Garden of Eden. Yeah, it's going back 10,000 years or something like that. Just a little bit older than Leave It to Beaver. So Ohio Wetlands Association is the nonprofit that I've stepped away from. Now I want to turn my efforts to wild ones, but we say wetlands for a better Ohio, wetlands for a better world, I think. And I'll be happy to take questions. And I will stop sharing.
I have a question.
Sure. Let me
This
figure out how to stop sharing.
Oh,
Stop share. Yes.
so
Okay.
my name's Mary. I am new here.
Hi, Mary.
You are definitely preaching to the choir. I love this. This is like wonderful information, and I agree with it all. But I was curious when you were talking about reclaiming the wetlands, say like along the Mississippi or, you know, wherever, and how
Yeah.
it would pay for itself. And I hear what you're saying, but what would like the farmers say, or the people who are living off that land? I mean, I kind of want to like, because that's always going to be this argument back to me, at least when I talk to people about stuff like this or just having conversations. And it's like, but you're taking away their land for farming. And I'm like, well, yeah, but like half the time they can't farm it, right? Or I don't know how often, but because it's flooding and, you know, you're messing with Mother Nature. So like, yes, you pay them for the land, but what about like what they consider their livelihood? What is the answer to that? Does that make sense?
No, that makes perfect sense. And that is the really big issue. And I think most people would argue that there is no authority, federal or state, that is going to have the will or the power to come in and say, this land is not yours anymore,
Okay.
because we're going to do this or that to it. So that whole idea of eminent domain is not a popular one. Especially when we're talking about 4 million acres or something like that.
Right.
And that is very true here in Ohio, in the Great Black Swamp in Northwest Ohio. So you don't have to go to the Mississippi. It's right here in our own state. And the people who settled the Maumee River Basin area were the last place to settle in Ohio because it was so difficult, because it was so wet, and it was impassable for most of the first 100 years that Ohio was a state. And the people who really toughed it out and cleared that and drained that don't want to reverse it. They worked hard. And now they've got some of the most productive farmland in the United States.
Right.
So, you know, but there are some places that are marginally productive because they are not as well drained as some of the others, that the investment in infrastructure still hasn't been done to make it so that you can get a good crop every year. If you ever drive up Route 2 between Sandusky and Toledo in the spring, you look at those fields, they're all flooded. You look at the ditches, they're canals.
Yep.
And it's all at lake level. So there's land that is a real challenge. So if you've got to run a pump the size of a big diesel tractor and your ditch is above grade, you got to pump it up into a ditch because your land is so low, there may be an opportunity there to convert marginal or very, very low profitable land into wetland. And that is being done. That has been done. Many of those areas along Lake Erie, along Route 2 there, along the Western Basin, were never converted to farmland because people said, oh, this is great duck hunting. We're just going to keep this in marsh and use it for recreational purposes. And those have been some of the best conservationists that you could hope for. I'm not a hunter, but I know the work that they have done and the wealth that has been put into some of those hunting clubs in order to stabilize the populations, in order to make them work for biodiversity and for their own pleasure and recreation, that sort of thing. But yeah, it takes willing landowners. At least that's the game plan that I see, and that is happening. And so there's groups in Northwest Ohio. One's called the Black Swamp Conservancy.
Yeah.
And they've been really good at finding willing landowners that say, hey, this land would be better used as a natural area than as a marginal piece of farmland. And so as that happens, then, bit by bit, you can get some of that back. And that's what the H2 Ohio program has been doing also.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ray. Does anybody else have any other questions or even comments? So just so everyone's aware, and I know sometimes it's not always popping up, but during these meetings, our chat is usually pretty popular. So make sure to pull it up and keep in there to see what people are posting in the chat. There's been a few links already and some good discussion items. So just something to be aware of. Thanks, Ray,
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah, it'd be great to see you, some of you at Vernal-Palooza.
Yes, and it was also mentioned
I see there's a link.
apparently
Yeah.
ODNR had, or no, OSU, I'm assuming the extension has a Woodland Stewards webinar tomorrow on creating vernal pools. So lots of good stuff.
Excellent. Excellent.